So this video is to show some examples of adding and subtracting fractions. So let's get started. So here we have two fractions that are being added together, -2/3 and 2/7. So the first thing when we're adding and subtracting fractions is we can only add or subtract them if they have the same denominator or common denominators. We can see here that they don't. This has a denominator of 3, this has a denominator of 7. So we can't add these numbers as they are now. We have to convert them to fractions that have common denominators. So one way to do that, I'll just rewrite these first, is to multiply each fraction so that its denominators match. So I'm going to multiply this fraction by some number. And we can't change the value of this. We want to still have something that equals -2/3. So we have to multiply this essentially by 1, right? A fraction that has the same numerator and denominator. So I'll just use this denominator on this side. So I'm going to multiply, I'll look at this denominator 7, so I'll multiply the numerator and denominator here. I'll put this in parentheses too, just to show we're multiplying, by 7/7, or 1. So it's the same value, but now it'll have a different denominator. And we'll use this denominator of 3 for our numerator and denominator over here. So we'll multiply this fraction by 3/3. So now we simplify. So 7 times -2 is -14. Make sure you're checking you have the correct sign. You can use that's off the page there. You can use a little triangle here to check your signs only when you multiply and divide. So negative times positive, you just cross out the negative, cross out the positive. So our result is negative, great. And then 7 times 3 is 21. So that's an equivalent fraction. -2/3 is equal to -14/21, or 21sts. And then we do the same here. 2 times 3 is 6 for a new numerator, and 7 times 3 is 21. So since we use the same numbers on both sides, we got common denominators. So from this point, I have a common denominator, so I'm really just going to concentrate on the numerators. And I'll just follow all the correct rules of adding and subtracting. So when I add and subtract numbers, just because it says plus here doesn't mean I'm going to actually do the calculation adding. I have to look at both signs. So this is negative and this is positive. So when the numbers have different signs, you subtract them. So I'll do that calculation here, in case you can't do it in your head. So 14 minus 6 is 8. So this is going to be 8/21. And then I have to decide, is that -8 or +8? So I should always take the sign of the number with the greatest absolute value. So that's -14 has more absolute value than 6, or a greater absolute value. And so this sign should always match the sign of my answer when adding and subtracting. So when I add -14 plus 6, I get -8, not +8. And then lastly, when dealing with fractions, you should always try to reduce. So I should look at these and see, do they have any common factors? If you can just look and you know your factors in your head, you can see that they don't. If you're unsure, you can always factor them, or prime factor them. We'll go down to the prime factors. So the prime factors of 8 are 2 times 2 times 2, and the prime factors of 21 are 3 times 7. So we can see that they don't share any common factors, which means we wouldn't be able to reduce it. There's no common factor to divide by. So this is our most simplified answer. So again, for adding and subtracting fractions, make sure you have a common denominator. An easy way to do that is just multiply this fraction by this denominator, both in numerator and denominator here, and do the same over here. So we see a 3 here, we used times 3 on the numerator and denominator. And then just add or subtract the numerators correctly and keep that same denominator. Don't add the denominators. Great. We'll do a couple more examples just to highlight some other things that might come up, other difficulties you might face. So here we can see we have a mixed number. You don't have to change to an improper fraction, but a lot of people do, so I'll show that. Maybe on another video someday I'll show adding and subtracting using mixed numbers. So let's just start by converting this to a mixed number. So 4 times 2 is 8, plus 3 is 11. So this is negative, don't lose that negative, -11/4. And then we have minus a negative 5/6. Another reason I chose this problem was also to remind us again, if we have minus a negative number, we have to, that's really plus positive, so we'll change that. So here we're just going to change, anytime you see minus negative, you should change that to adding the positive. So we'll keep our negative 11/4, and you could have done this first and then the mixed number, that would have been fine. And this just becomes plus positive 5/6. Some people like to just draw a plus there to show that. But so really now we're ready to do what we did in the previous problem. So now we'll find a common denominator. There are other ways to find common denominators. You can look for greatest common or least common multiple. I'm not going to show that here because I want to show reducing at the end. So we'll have to reduce this at the end. So I'll do the same method of finding a common denominator that I used previously, which is just to multiply by the opposite denominator. So I'll multiply this by 6/6 here. Put that in parentheses too. And then we'll use 4. We'll multiply numerator and denominator by 4/4. And that will always get us a common denominator. It may not be the least or smallest common denominator. That just means we may have to reduce in the end. But in this case, I want to show a case where we have to reduce the fraction, so that's okay. So now just multiply correctly. We have positive times negative here. 6 times negative 11, so that's positive times negative, so we should get negative. So that's going to be negative 66, and then 6 times 4 is 24. And then here, again in the denominator, 6 times 4 is 24. Again, we found common denominators. Makes sense, right? If you see we're multiplying by the same numbers in the denominator, so it makes sense we would get the same result always for our denominator. And then our numerator, 5 times 4 is 20. So then here, we see that we have different signs. We have a negative and a positive number. So anytime you're adding positive and negative numbers, different signs, you subtract those numbers. So I'm going to do, the calculation that I'm doing is 66 minus 20, so that's 46. And then you always take the sign of the number when you add or subtract that has the greatest absolute value. So negative 66 has a greater absolute value than 20. I like to think, well, the definition of absolute value, it's farther from the 0, so it's going to determine the sign. So this negative is going to overwhelm this positive. So our answer is negative 46. And that calculation I just did was 66 minus 20 is 46, right? But then negative 46. So that's an answer, but it's not simplified, it's not reduced. We should always simplify or reduce our fractions when we can. So I'm going to, again, show prime factoring. I think it's really useful to prime factor. So I'm going to prime factor 46. So let's see, that's 2 times 23. And 23 is a prime number, so I have to stop. Both 2 and 23 are prime. I'll factor 24, 2 times 12. I can keep going. 2 times 6, 2 times 3. So here, my prime factors are 2 times 2. It's kind of a messy 2. 2 times 2 times 2 times 3. Those are the prime factors. So 24 is made out of 2 times 2 times 2 times 3. And 46 is 2 times 23. So we can see that this 2, they share 1 2 in common, meaning I could divide numerator and denominator by 2. So 46 divided by 2 is going to be 23. So negative 23, don't lose that negative. And then 24 divided by 2 is 12, these leftover factors. 2 times 2 times 3 is 12. And we can be confident that that is reduced. You can also then change this to a mixed number. This is a reduced improper fraction, which is fine. You can also convert it to a mixed number, so I'll show that. So there's nothing wrong with this answer. It's reduced, simplified, it's great. But if you want to go to a mixed number, you can just do this division. Negative 23 divided by 12. 12 goes in 1 time with a remainder of 11, so that's going to be negative 1 and 11/12. So this is also equal to negative, don't lose your negative, negative 1 and 11/12. And that's also a great simplified or reduced answer. So both of these we ended up subtracting the numerators. So I'll do one more example where we're adding the numerators, just to give one more example. So here we go. So we can see here that there's no minus negative. We don't have to worry about that this time. But let's change to improper fractions. So I'll keep negative 2/3 the same. Minus 6 times 1 is 6, plus 5 is 11. So that's minus 11/6. And again, I could just change this to sixths. And I'll do that. So this time I'll show not just multiplying, but in this case I see that. So if you see a way to use a smaller common denominator than just doing 3 times 6 is 18, you should do that. So in this case, I see that if I multiplied 3 times 2, I would get 6. So I won't change this. I'll just change this one fraction by multiplying top and bottom by 2. Now, there's nothing wrong. I could have done times 3 here and times 6 here. I just would have reduced more in the end. That's fine. But if you see something smaller that you can use, you might as well use it. So here I have 2 times negative 2. That's negative 4. 2 times 3 is 6. Again, if you're unsure when multiplying or dividing of what your sign should be, if there's any negatives involved, you can just check here, negative times positive. So negative times positive is negative. So negative 4/6 minus 11/6. So we can see we only had to change this one. We have common denominators. That's what's important. Get those common denominators before you add or subtract. Now in this case, even though this says minus here, I can think of this as plus negative 11, if you like to change it to plus negative 11. So an alternate way to write this, right, would be like this. Subtracting a number is like adding its negative. But if you already know that, you can just proceed right from here. So these have same signs, right? Same signs. So that means I need to add them, even though this says minus here. And we can see why here, right? Plus negative. So we're going to add those. So I'll bring this up here. So I'm going to do 4 plus 11 is 15. And then, of course, I'm going to keep the sign of my number with the greatest absolute value. So in this case, that's negative 11. So this should definitely be negative. Don't forget that negative. And keep our denominator of 6. Now again, that's a great answer, but it's not simplified. I can see that it has a common factor. If you can't, you can always prime factor both numerator and denominator, and we can see very clearly here that they share a common factor of 3, meaning that's what I could reduce or divide both numerator and denominator by. So negative 15 divided by 3 is going to be negative 5, and 6 divided by 3 is 2. So that's my simplified improper fraction. And again, if I want my answer to be a mixed number, that's fine. Just divide 5 divided by 2, or negative 5 divided by 2, excuse me. 2 times 2 is 4. So it's going to be negative 2 and 1/2. So this is negative, don't lose that negative, negative 2 and 1/2. So those are both good answers. One's a reduced or simplified improper fraction, and one's a simplified mixed number. So hopefully that's helpful for you if you're adding or subtracting fractions.